Hello and welcome back. This is the week 9 lecture. So we are back from spring break, and hopefully by now we've all submitted our midterm essay so we can officially start on the second half of the semester here in week 9. And that's kind of appropriate because where we find ourselves here in week 9 might feel a little bit more modern, a little bit more contemporary, certainly compared to where we started out. So by this week, we have moved up to the 1960s. So we continue to sort of follow this chronology of movie history. So if you remember, our last film before the break was On the Waterfront, a great example of 1950s filmmaking, but in a lot of ways, still very recognizably old to us, right? In black and white, very much a response to kind of the post-war atmosphere in America, like we talked about, sort of stylistically, the gritty, sort of grim subject matter sort of captured a particular time and place, and it was also one of the more successful, sort of influential American movies of the 50s. So now, after the break, we've moved about a decade ahead, and we are now in the late 1960s. So a lot is changing. A lot of things are shifting in the movie world. And we talked about some of this stuff back in week 8. The big Hollywood studios are beginning to lose more and more of their power. And we talked about some of the reasons for that. Television and the popularity of television beginning around the 50s, when pretty much, any somewhat affluent American family could probably afford a TV for their home. We talked about how this was a big source of competition for movies, right? Television gives people an alternative, something else you can watch, and how convenient you don't even have to leave the comfort of your home. So there was a lot of tension, friction early on between movies and TV. We talked about that. But then beginning in the 50s, you start to see studios selling their film catalogs, their libraries, basically to TV networks, TV stations, so those TV networks can then show the movies on TV, a tradition that remains with us today, although in a slightly different form. So we talked about TV and how that's beginning to change the movies, not just how movies are marketed and shown and watched, but even some stylistic aspects of movies begin to shift as movie makers adapt to the reality that eventually their movies will be seen on TV. Not right away, right? They play in theaters first, but then later on they'll play on TV. So that's happening. Also, serious antitrust actions taken by the federal government also weaken the studios. Really kind of this starts happening right after World War II. So like we said in week 8, some of this antitrust stuff is already happening in the 50s, and studios are having to adapt. They're starting to lose a lot of their vertical integration, like we talked about, their ability to control all levers, all levels of the movie industry. That would have included, production, distribution, and distribution. Production, distribution, and exhibition. So they got the movies made. They were responsible for supplying those movies to movie theaters so the movies could be shown. And in many cases, the studios even exercised control over the theaters themselves. So that was part of why they attracted the attention of the government. It seemed like a monopoly, right? And monopolies are supposed to be illegal in this country. So you can't cut off all forms of competition, right? You have to allow other people to provide the same service, and you're competing with those other providers, trying to get as many customers to buy your product. But for a long time, Hollywood did not really allow for much outside competition. Like we said, over 75% of all movie productions in America went through Hollywood studios. So it was not impossible to get an independent movie produced, something outside the Hollywood system, but it was very, very difficult. And we'll start talking more about independent movies this week. An independent movie is just a movie that comes from outside of Hollywood, from an independent studio. In many cases, they're sort of made outside the studio system completely, but then maybe they'll then get the movie sold through a distribution company, and then eventually the movie can be seen in theaters. But independent movies had been around, but traditionally, back in the 50s, for example, to get an independent production off the ground, you needed to sort of already be a big shot in the industry. So we mentioned weeks ago that John Ford created his own production company, and that's how he made The Fugitive back in the 40s. But John Ford was already famous, right? He was already a successful director, so he had the money and the reputation in the industry to be able to found his own production company. So then he had more artistic control over the movies that he made because he could finance his own movies through his own production company. But he could only do that because he was John Ford, because he had already had a successful career, made a lot of money, and he had the reputation necessary to make a move like that. So it was just very hard to operate outside of the Hollywood system. And the government took notice. The government was like, yeah, we think you guys are kind of breaking the law in the way that you're monopolizing this particular industry. So by the 1960s, the government had taken a lot of actions that weakened the studios. And like I said before, they lost their vertical integration. They often lost control of movie theaters. They sometimes lost control of distribution as well. So increasingly, studios could only control production. And even within that realm, they weren't able to keep directors and screenwriters and actors under such strict contracts. We kind of heard in in previous weeks, how these studio heads really controlled the creative types and could lock them down under long-term contracts, which would then not allow a director or an actor to go work for another studio. You couldn't go and make another movie for a different studio while you were still under contract with whatever studio had originally signed you. So there was a lack of freedom, a lack of movement that the government decided to crack down on. So by the 60s, the effects of that are really being felt. Now, it's important to remember that the studios don't go away. We still have a lot of these big studios today, but just the way they did business started to change. And directors and actors and other creative types started having more freedom. Independent productions became more possible. And all of this contributes to the larger sort of climate of change that we notice in the 60s. As TV gets bigger, as the studios lose a little bit of their control, things start to open up. And generally, when that's the case, you see more innovation, a sort of explosion in creativity, some new techniques, different styles, and that's all happening here in the 60s. And Bullet, our film for this week, is a great example. So the chapter that we're reading here in week 9 is called The New Hollywood. Now, that is a famously difficult phrase to define. There's kind of different things we can mean by that. The chapter that we're reading, the author of that chapter kind of defines the term a little bit differently than I do and some other film scholars would. But generally, we can just think of it as a very broad term that applies to this period that we're describing, right? Because a lot of change is happening. So we end up with kind of a new Hollywood. It's not completely different from the old Hollywood, but it is a lot different because the world is different. New technology, new things are happening politically, socially, culturally. We know the 60s are a time of a lot of social upheaval. We've all learned that in previous classes. So we know, Vietnam and a lot of, the civil rights movement is going on. So a lot of protests, a lot of uh, instability in some ways, political assassinations, change can sometimes look a lot like that. So all of that's happening and it's affecting the movies in various ways. But just to kind of go back to a quick thing about TV, because we were discussing television last time, by the 70s, by the beginning of the 70s, pretty much all the Hollywood studios had sold their syndication rights to all their movies so they could be shown on TV. Remember, we said this process began in the 50s and it's continuing throughout the 60s. And by the 70s, all the studios had sold their catalogs to TV networks. And also, more and more TV movies are getting made throughout the 60s and 70s. More movies that are intended for television. They are made to be shown on television. So, as that's happening, there's kind of becoming more and more of a blurry line between television and movies. There used to be a really strong distinction at the very beginning of television. But by the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, you could watch a lot of theatrical movies on TV, and you could also watch a lot of movies made for TV that looked a lot like movies in theaters, right? They had a lot of similarities, and a lot of famous directors, Steven Spielberg being a great example, actually got his start directing movies for TV. So there's a lot of overlap increasingly between these two mediums, movies and TV. Also, as the book points out, a lot of sort of old-timey, old golden age of Hollywood stuff kind of is totally phased out by the end of the 60s and the early 70s. So like the concept of B movies, which were a staple of the old studio system, cheap, usually kind of more stereotypical genre movies that could be made cheaper, but were often very popular. That concept kind of goes away. Like certain aspects of B movies remain, but that sort of idea of a sort of cheaper type of movie that the studio would make, that sort of goes away, along with opening newsreels, which would have previously played before the featured attraction, before the movie that you go to see. There might have been some cartoons or a newsreel or some like comic short films that would have come before the main movie. Those have pretty much disappeared by the end of the 60s, and they're replaced by previews, something that we're still familiar with today, coming attractions, telling people about future movies that are going to be playing soon. And another key concept that really gets introduced by the 70s is the idea of the blockbuster. And this is another concept that is still very much with us. A blockbuster is just a big budget Hollywood studio movie designed to get as many people in the theater as possible. So these are often big spectacles. Again, they're big, expensive movies. So the book mentions a couple of early examples of blockbusters that come out really in the 70s. They mentioned Jaws, which is directed by Spielberg. They mentioned Star Wars, the first Star Wars, which comes out in 1976. So in some ways, the blockbuster concept had kind of existed previously. The name was new, but the idea of big budget, epic movies that really took people on a wild ride, had special effects, loud music. You really wanted to watch it on a big screen to capture all the action, the sort of grand scale of the visuals. Like those kinds of movies had existed really going all the way back to the early 20th century. We saw an epic from the 1920s, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. So those kinds of movies had always been around. But by the 70s, we had gotten really expert at marketing them. And a few few sort of more modern aspects came into play. So traditionally, blockbusters started to come out in the summertime, which is still the case, right? We're trying to draw in as big of an audience as possible. So it's ideal if the kids are out of school, maybe some people have time off work, you're going to get more people in the theater during the summer. So the ways that we marketed these kinds of movies, the ways they were distributed and exhibited, all became a little bit more well defined and sort of standardized. And these were, of course, big money makers for the studios. So increasingly, as they also kind of mention in the book, studios went hunting for blockbusters, right? And that's a mentality that I think still very much exists today. So these are all things that we still see with modern movies, and they became pretty standard by the 70s. So we can use this term, the new Hollywood, to basically refer to all of this. Now, different people will define it in slightly different ways. It's often defined as really beginning in the 60s, this era called the New Hollywood, and then it extends up through the end of the 70s, maybe, according to some, even into the early 1980s. Now, other historians and scholars will have a more sort of condensed timeline. Like some will say it started in 67 and basically was over by like 74 or 75. And I think that's a little bit restrictive. And some scholars, and I believe the author of our book is one of them, they actually think that the dawn of the modern blockbuster around the middle of the 1970s sort of kills the new Hollywood, sort of kills this period of creativity and technical innovation and sort of experimentation, and instead studios start looking for the next big blockbuster. I think there's some truth to that. I don't think these eras are quite so neat, right? There's always some overlap, though. That's what we have to remember. So even as blockbusters start coming out, I think aspects of the new Hollywood remain. But by the 80s, we're going to notice sort of another shift and another change. But yeah, the new Hollywood really refers to new kinds of movies, a sort of new crop of directors, like a new generation of filmmakers who get famous, and some of them are still working or at least still alive today. Spielberg being an example, but also it just kind of encompasses this larger movement, this larger shift in Hollywood, which affects everything from the finances, the back end stuff, to the actual creative product on film, on screen. So in many ways, the new Hollywood is challenging some of the traditional sort of filmmaking styles that we've seen in the old Hollywood. They're moving away from some of the happy endings. They're moving away from some of the clear-cut moral guidelines that you would have seen in older movies. We even saw this a little bit with On the Waterfront. More moral ambiguity after World War II, right? People are a little bit disillusioned. A lot of people are going through maybe some tough times. So more of a recognition or more of a desire for realism. We talked about that already starting in the 50s, and it would very much be a big part of New Hollywood, looking for some kind of authenticity, moving away from the highly artificial style of a lot of movies in the classical sort of golden age of Hollywood in the 30s and 40s, moving away from that and looking for something different, something a little more modern, something that seemed to really fit the time and place place better. A time of great change, social upheaval, things are a little bit unstable, and things are happening fast. So they embrace the auteur theory. We've talked about this as really coming over from France, an idea that was sort of coined by French filmmakers and film scholars, but they were often talking about American directors. Just this idea that a director of a movie kind of functions like the author of a novel or the playwright who puts together a theatrical performance. They are the sort of primary sort of creative engine of the film, but also this idea that goes along with it, which is an auteur sort of brings his own personal vision to a movie that he directs, right? So it's not just a typical gangster movie. It's not just a typical Western. It's not one of these sort of rehash of an old genre. They might be using some of those old genres, but they're also expressing their own personality, their own views, their own sort of take on the genre. And they might do some things differently with the genre. They might, sort of update it or even pay homage to older forms while also sort of updating them or adapting them to a new sort of, setting or a new time. So more of that kind of way of seeing the creative process, which again is different when you think it compared to, earlier Hollywood decades where they really had that factory model of studio movie production where everybody had a role, right? The movies were getting made very quickly, efficiently, largely being shot on sound stages, assembled sets, often inside, right? And there was kind of that factory model of efficiency that allowed Hollywood to become so successful and dominant in the first place. But now, as things are sort of opening up, loosening up a little bit, you have a lot of young filmmakers who want to do something different. They want to get away from a lot of studio shooting, using those sound stages, using those kind of artificial sets. They want a more natural, realistic look, like we talked about in week 8. So that often means on location shooting. We're not going to create a set that looks like San Francisco. Instead, in Bullet, we're going to film the whole movie in San Francisco. We're going to shoot it on location, so it looks more authentic. We're actually in the city, on the streets, looking at buildings. Yes, there's some interior shots that can be done on a soundstage, but we can also tell in a lot of the scenes and a lot of the shots that we are in the city. So it's more natural, it's more realistic. Also, these kind of new Hollywood filmmakers, they often preferred smaller cameras that were kind of easier to move around with. And again, this is a trend that was starting in the years right after the war. We saw it in Europe with some of the new European styles that were emerging. Again, more realistic, more focused with on location shooting. And that kind of comes over here a little bit later. Also, using editing in a different way. So like we talked about for decades, editing was really seen as simply continuity, right? Making sure that one shot or one action logically follows the previous shot or the previous action to try to create this illusion that all of this is really happening and it's all happening continuously. But by the 60s and 70s, again, influenced by a lot of European filmmakers, these new Hollywood directors wanted to use editing differently. They wanted to use editing as more of an artistic device. They weren't always as concerned about continuity. So that means sometimes there would be a jump cut where we might skip over some actions. One shot might not always logically lead to the very next shot. We might jump ahead, or we might jump back, or a certain action or a certain shot might get repeated. And sometimes that can be fun and interesting, or the filmmakers can be doing some of that in order to make a point. in order to express the state of mind of a particular character, or perhaps somebody is experiencing an altered reality. A lot of people were doing a lot of drugs in the 60s, so this was just a more artistic way of utilizing editing. And like the French New Wave and other European movements, they weren't afraid of jump cuts, non-linear or non-continuous editing. Sometimes the editing would get a little bit faster too, a little bit flashier. Sometimes the duration of individual shots would start to shrink, and we would have faster cuts from shot to shot. If you watch a lot of modern movies, you'll notice that the typical shot does not last very long, right? And that's a little bit of a change compared to older movies. If you go back to the old Hollywood, shots tended to be a little bit longer, right? Cameras tended to be bigger and bulkier, so it took longer to set up a shot, and it wasn't always as easy to move the camera around. That was true, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, but by now in the 60s and 70s we have more camera movement, we have shorter shots, we have just more of a sort of kinetic sense of activity and movement. You can very much see that in Bullet. Even if the story might drag at times, you might feel like there are some slow moments, most of the shots are pretty short. If you're looking closely. So editing is changing. Certain techniques with camera work, cinematography are also changing, and we're doing more on location shooting. So a lot of that is quite a bit different from the older model of Hollywood movies. So just to name a few famous examples of new Hollywood films, again, films that were important both in terms of their stories, but also what they were doing technically, visually. The directors who made them usually went on to do other stuff, became often quite famous, and there would also be some very famous actors in a lot of these movies who would go on to do a lot of other stuff. So again, this era maybe begins like the late 60s, according to most. So The Graduate comes out in 1967, starring Dustin Hoffman, directed by Mike Nichols, sort of a coming-of-age story about disaffected, alienated youth trying to find their place in the world during this time of social upheaval. Bullet comes out in 1968. We'll talk more about that. Bonnie and Clyde comes out in 1967, directed by Arthur Penn, starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, who both go on to be huge movie stars. I mean, I guess Beatty probably already was by then, but they both go on to do a lot of other stuff for decades. Easy Rider comes out in 1969, kind of a road movie featuring hippies and other sort of countercultural type characters, directed by Dennis Hopper, who also stars in the film. The Conversation comes out in 1974, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. Taxi Driver in 1976, directed by Martin Scorsese, who's still around, as is Coppola. They're both very old, but they both continue to make movies. And then The Deer Hunter comes out in 1978, directed by Michael Cimino. That kind of takes us to the end of the 70s. But again, the author of our chapter that we're reading this week, the chapter actually entitled The New Hollywood, he's really talking more about blockbusters. So Jaws, Star Wars. We're going to see and talk about more examples of blockbusters as we move later in the semester. But these were really the first movies that, according to our author, sort of showed producers and studio heads that a single movie could earn a studio hundreds of millions of dollars in profits. So there had always been big movies, but they start getting bigger and more profitable maybe towards the end of this new Hollywood era. So again, a rise of new filmmakers, Scorsese, Coppola, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, who directs Star Wars. These guys would be titans for years in the movie industry, and they really kind of got their start, made it big in the 60s and 70s. So all of these guys were really influenced by European films, a lot of these trends that we talked about in post-war Europe, but they also loved old Hollywood genre movies. So they loved old westerns, they loved old gangster movies, all those sort of classic genres that Hollywood did so well during its golden age. So a lot of times these new Hollywood directors are kind of viewed as taking a lot of these old genres, classical sort of movie making stuff, and then putting their own distinctive spin on those genres, on those styles, right? Putting their own sort of innovative touches on genres and styles that were very popular and familiar to audiences. So, not reinventing the wheel, but doing some things differently, going on location, doing different things with camera work, with editing, with music. We even talked about some changes in acting, right? Going back to the 1950s and the rise of method acting, right? So even with actors now, we have different techniques. They're doing things a little bit differently compared to actors back in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And there's some obvious reasons for that, right? I mean, obviously, silent acting was very different, but we've noticed that actors too are getting more natural or more realistic by trying to inhabit their role in a more sort of complete way, like we were saying with Marlon Brando and the method acting technique that he helped to popularize in the 50s, where he's making his decisions in each scene based on what he thinks his character will do. He's not thinking so much, what would I, Marlon Brando, do? He's not holding himself separate from his character, but he is the character, at least while shooting is going on, while they're actually involved in the production of the movie. So that creates what a lot of critics and scholars would say is a little bit more interiority. If you guys know that term, that's a good thing to talk about if you're going to discuss acting, right? Interiority, giving the audience a sense of the character's inner life, what the character is thinking, what is the character going through emotionally. It can be hard to convey that in a movie. You know, if you think about the difference between, say, a book, like a novel, and a movie, one of the big differences, and that's very important for narrative, is in a novel, the author can tell you what a character is thinking. And it's very common for narrators or authors to do that, right? They can tell you exactly what's going on in the mind of a character. But it's harder to do that in a movie. You might have voiceover narration that can do some of that, but it's a little bit awkward to do it all the time, to always have a narrator, you know, in a movie telling you what a character's thinking. So often a character has to convey it through, you know, expressions, through their body language, their intonation, you know, their tone of voice, how they put emphasis on things. So it's sort of, again, a more modern, realistic form of acting that suits this new style of filmmaking. So again, some historians, like this guy in the book, would sort of argue that after about 7 or 8 years of really creatively fertile movie making, we kind of have an abrupt end to the new Hollywood around 74 or 75 because of the blockbusters. As the blockbusters become more dominant, studios favor this kind of blockbuster model instead of investing in more creative, innovative films. So we might be able to find a parallel to our own present moment, because a lot of film scholars today would argue that something similar has happened in modern Hollywood, with our studios today wanting to make sequels and sort of reusing old intellectual property, or doing, you know, more superhero movies, you know, going for the safe bet. going for a sequel of a very popular movie or doing another, Marvel thing just because those have been profitable before and wanting to stick with that profitable sort of model instead of trying new things. So, again, the sequels, the remakes, the old IP. Some people would argue that studios have been kind of guilty of falling back on all of that too much ever since the 70s. We can probably see some examples of that still happening today. But by now, in our present moment, independent film production is a lot more possible than it used to be. So there's always an alternative to whatever the studios have to offer. Some other big changes that we need to be aware of, and we'll talk about more in the weeks to come, the rise of the video cassette. So I'm going to date myself, of course, but this is a huge development. The rise of being able to watch movies on videotape. This is big, and it doesn't really take over until the 80s. But as early as the 70s, we have kind of an early version of the video cassette in the Betamax. And then by the 80s, you have VHS tapes, right, which you can rent at a video store, at a Blockbuster, which you don't really have anymore. But this is another way, of course, to watch movies, right? Instead of going to the theater and instead of waiting a year for the movie to play on TV, you can go to the video store a little bit after the theatrical run and maybe a little before it appears on network TV, and you can rent the movie on a video cassette, go home, watch it at your leisure. You can watch it more than once. You can get as much use out of that cassette as you can for 2 or 3 days, and then you have to return it. So this became a dominant model of movie watching really beginning in the 80s when VHSs really took off and you started getting a lot of video rental stores. And then it continues to be a dominant mode throughout the 90s as we transition to DVDs. So when I was growing up in the 90s, this was a way to watch a lot of movies. Go to Blockbuster, rent some DVDs, especially if you lived in a small town where a lot of big movies weren't going to play. A lot of movies were never going to come to your town like the big blockbusters would, right? But maybe more sort of artistic, creative movies, they weren't going to play in your small town or your mid-sized town. So you could wait and rent them from your neighborhood Blockbuster. So that's a really big change, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in the weeks to come, but that's starting as early as the 70s. And also, as I've said, more and more independent productions. So what starts happening in the 70s and 80s and will continue beyond that is that studios start to kind of get in on the independent filmmaking business. So studios can't control everything anymore, right? They've lost some of their power. They can't control production, distribution, and exhibition. But what a lot of big studios start to do is they kind of create a branch or a sort of wing of their business that's largely devoted to finding young, unknown independent filmmakers who might have made a movie on the cheap, but they don't have any way of getting it distributed or exhibited. So the studio can come in and buy the already made movie. They can get in on the distribution of the movie, and they can make money without necessarily having produced the movie themselves. So this is the way a lot of independent filmmakers will get discovered. When they make their first movie, they're not working for a studio, right? They're just spending whatever money they have. They're often filming with friends, maybe sort of like a semi-professional crew. And then if it's good, if they get interest, they're able to sell that movie to a distribution company, which might be owned by one of the studios, studios. It might be a subsidiary of one of the studios. And if that movie does well, it might get a limited theatrical release. Then it's going to be on VHS. Then it's going to be on TV, right? And eventually a lot of people can watch it. And then if that filmmaker finds success, they might get signed to a big studio to make their second movie, right? And they move up in the world. So that's increasingly happening in this new version of Hollywood, where independent productions are more possible. So you have young people, film students, right? People operating outside of that Hollywood structure, doing their own thing. So you get more voices, you get a more diverse array of voices, different kinds of people. As you can probably imagine, for a long time, most Hollywood directors were white men. Most Hollywood screenwriters were white men. So with independent production, you can get more different kinds of people making movies. So that's usually thought of as a good thing. But independent filmmaking does not mean the death of big studios. Like I said, if anything, studios eventually kind of get in on it. And they're like, okay, let's have a sort of arty branch of our studio that specializes in independently produced movies. And we can sell them. We can eventually start making them. And we'll make money off of those too. So a lot of the old studios, they're still around. They're still making tons of money even today. Universal, 20th Century Fox, they're still around. Columbia Pictures is still around, but they're now owned by Sony. So there's been lots of corporate mergers, of course, lots of things we don't have to worry about. And there's been some new studios that have emerged, like Disney. Right? Disney used to specialize only in animated films, but now it is a powerhouse studio. They own a bunch of TV networks. They produce all kinds and distribute all kinds of different movies. So you have some old standbys that are still around. In other cases, they merge, they change ownership. Or they might merge with some other company, but then also some new studios emerge to also compete with the older ones. Also, you have the rise of like HBO and cable TV beginning in the 70s, but really taking off in the 80s. So you have cable television, satellite TV, and these are all new markets for the studios, new places where these movies can be shown. And of course, nowadays we have streaming. But long before streaming, we had HBO. We had these new channels that came around. They started producing some of their own movies, but they could also show older Hollywood movies. So all of that's happening, and all of that's kind of part of the new Hollywood. But in some ways, the new Hollywood looks a little bit like the old Hollywood. Some of the same studios making some of the same kinds of movies, still exporting a lot of these movies overseas to international markets. Studio heads still get rich. Directors and actors still get famous. A lot of it's the same, but there's a lot of new stuff happening as well. So like I said, Bullitt is a great example of this new era and the sort of technical innovation, but also the different sort of narrative style. And I would say the movie's also a great showcase for Steve McQueen, who was a big movie star during the 60s and 70s. You might, if you're a young person, you might ask your parents or maybe grandparents. They probably know who Steve McQueen is. He was a big deal at around the time that this movie came out. And Bullitt, I mean, he was already well known, but Bullitt makes him an even bigger star. So this movie gives us a good example of a lot of modern components of movies that we can still recognize today. A big movie star, a famous car chase sequence, but also a lot of the characteristics of the new Hollywood. On location shooting, lots of interesting camera work. They're using a lightweight camera called the Aeroflex. We don't have to be too concerned with that, but it was kind of revolutionary during these decades because it allowed for quicker, more mobile shooting filming which was very well suited to on location shoots like this one. Again, using actual locations instead of manufactured sets or sound stages in Hollywood. So there's filming on location in San Francisco. This film is directed by Peter Yates, who is not really thought of as a member of the new Hollywood crew. Maybe that's not fair, but he was a little bit older than most of those new Hollywood types like Spielberg, Coppola, Scorsese, and also Yates is not American. So this is an American film, but Yates was from England, and he got his start making movies over there. He later made multiple American movies, but actually Bullitt was his last one. He doesn't make any more Hollywood films, I don't think. After Bullitt, he goes back to the UK and continues to work there. So he's not really considered as like a peer of those other new Hollywood figures that I mentioned. But this movie is often thought of as a good example of new Hollywood, and Yates is kind of adapting to the cutting edge styles, the stuff that's going on at that time. Another thing this film is known for is its attention to detail. And again, something that was very deliberate, something that Yates and the screenwriter and even Steve McQueen, the star, very much set out to do. Really looking to achieve realism. So if you watch the movie, you'll notice they have a lot of attention paid to like procedural details, trying to get everything right. Whether that pertains to police, processing evidence, or that scene in the hospital where we see like the emergency room and we see doctors and nurses. A lot of those doctors and nurses are real doctors and nurses. They're not actors. They were real medical professionals who were cast in the movie. And that was all very intentional. Like I said, Yates wanted real people to fill some of these roles because they were really striving for a high level of authenticity and realism. So in many ways, this is a very familiar type of movie. It's a cop movie, right? McQueen's a tough cop. It's all about his sort of quest for justice and to get to the bottom of this sort of criminal enterprise. So we've had movies like this forever, right? This has been a popular movie genre going back to the silent film era. So the genre is very familiar, right? Heroic cop trying to stop bad guys in a big city. Like, we've had that for a long time, but we're putting a new twist on it. And part of that's McQueen. Part of that is how they shoot the movie. And a lot of that has to do with realism, making it seem like real cops in a real place, real doctors, real accurate procedural details, compared to a lot of the old cop movies that would have been filmed on a soundstage in Burbank, and there really wasn't a lot of authenticity. It might have been a good movie, but it wasn't capturing what those cops would have really done and what it would have really looked like, what it have really sounded like. They were striving for that in this movie. So there's a famous quote from McQueen where he says, the thing we try, this is a quote directly from him, the thing we tried to achieve was not to do a theatrical film, but a film about reality. So again, trying to capture the real thing. So that meant paying close attention to detail, casting some non-professional actors, and also filming on location. And if we think a little bit more about McQueen and his performance, a couple of things to note. Number one, many argue that he's actually playing a well-known real-life San Francisco police detective named Dave Toschi, who's a real person. You can look him up. And even like the way McQueen wears his gun, like his shoulder holster that you see throughout the film, apparently he was inspired to do that because that's how Dave Toschi wore his gun. And in order to really get the role right, legend has it that McQueen spent some time with real San Francisco cops before filming began. And legend has it that he hung out with Tashi. He thought Tashi was super cool. So he kind of copied the way Tashi dressed, the way Tashi kind of carried himself, both to be authentic and just because I think McQueen liked the guy. So a lot of times people view the performance as being an original performance, but also being at least inspired by a real San Francisco cop. Tashi was also one of the investigators of the Zodiac killer. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that particular case, but that's also the premise of a really good movie, Zodiac, directed by David Fincher, starring Mark Ruffalo as the real Dave Tashi, because he investigated the Zodiac killer, but of course never found him because those murders perpetrated by that serial killer in the Bay Area remain unsolved to this day. So that's another film to check out if you're interested. Zodiac, also filmed very much on location in San Francisco. All right, so if we talk about this movie, we have to talk about Steve McQueen, sure. New Hollywood, yes, but also that famous car chase sequence. It's what most people remember about Bullitt. They remember Steve McQueen, they remember his Ford Mustang that he's driving during that scene, and then the black Dodge Charger that he's sort of battling on the open roads. It wasn't the first chase scene that we had ever seen in a Hollywood movie, but it's probably the first one that really feels modern. The way it was shot, the way it was edited, the way it looks. And again, they're on real streets in San Francisco. So there's a level of authenticity there that you would not have seen in previous car chase sequences. So there's a level of realism, and a lot of that has to do with the way they did it, the technology, the techniques, but it was also just like their whole attitude. Their whole attitude with this movie was, let's make it as realistic as possible. So if you're watching, you might want to pay attention to the actual duration of this sequence. So it begins right past the minute 05 mark. So if you're watching and you're kind of paying attention to how much time has passed in the movie, you can stop it and maybe return to this sequence. So right around 1 hour and 5 minutes, we see McQueen getting, or his character, Bullitt, Frank Bullitt, getting dropped off at his car. He's in a taxi. He gets dropped off where his car is parked. And this is right past the 1 hour, 5 minute mark. And then he spots the Charger and the car chase begins. It's a pretty lengthy sequence. It lasts almost a full 10 minutes. So it starts right past a minute 05 and it concludes right past a minute 15. So officially it is 9 minutes and 42 seconds of car chase, car pursuit. That's pretty long, right? That's a long sequence. In previous decades, they wouldn't have done it for that long. It wouldn't have looked very good. It wouldn't have looked realistic. It wouldn't have been compelling enough to keep us engaged for nearly 10 minutes. But in this movie, it really works. So they use a couple of different techniques that you can probably notice. One of them is the point of view shot. So we get a lot of shots from the driver's point of view, showing us what it would look like behind the wheel of McQueen's car as he's driving around navigating these streets. So that gives the viewers a real sort of sense of being there, being almost like a participant in the chase. It took them a really long time to get all of this done. Filming for the car chase. Forget the rest of the movie. Filming the car chase took roughly 3 weeks. And again, they ended up with almost 10 minutes of footage in the movie. But as you can imagine, this was not all shot continuously. It was not shot in order. They had a lot of different shots that were spliced together. Multiple takes were often spliced together to create the single end product, but that actually resulted in some discontinuity because of the way they were assembling shots out of order. Sometimes if you're paying close attention, you can notice a couple of examples of discontinuity. One of the famous ones is that at one point we see some very heavy damage on the passenger side of Bullitt's car, the Mustang. But that we see that before the accident in the movie happens that actually causes the damage. So again, they're assembling the shots out of order. So if you're paying close attention, you might be able to notice some of the discontinuity, but you kind of have to really be looking for it. It's not super noticeable. Another example is that the Charger at one point appears to lose 5 different wheel covers. And of course, there's only 4 wheels. So that's something you can notice if you're paying close attention. Different covers are missing in different shots. So again, it's not all continuous the way it's been assembled. But aside from a few glitches like those, it does look pretty seamless. And they're shooting simultaneously from a lot of different angles. Right? So they have cameras set up in a lot of different stations on the roadside so they can capture a lot of different angles, a lot of different sort of vantage points of these cars as they drive down real streets. So they were able to block off a few streets in the city and then also a few streets right outside the city. They kind of leave the downtown area and they kind of end up over the course of the chase in kind of more open roads, kind of this, the outskirts of the city. So they're able to, again, use real locations to do that. But again, because they're kind of doing this montage, they're getting all these different angles, all these different shots, and assembling them not always in continuous order. As a result, you can, notice, in addition to the discontinuity, you can notice that they are on the same street multiple times, right? They had to reuse some of the same streets and some of the same cars that are passing. So again, to create a realistic car chase, you need other cars on the road. It can't just be the 2 cars that are involved in the chase, right? So if you pay close attention, some of the cars passing by are the same car, and they appear multiple times in multiple shots, even in multiple locations. A famous example that movie nerds picked out years ago was a green Volkswagen Beetle. Apparently, you can see it multiple times in multiple places, but viewers typically don't notice that when they're watching. Again, unless you've been told to look for these errors, you're not really going to notice, and you might even chalk it up to the idea that there are multiple cars on the road that look the same, many different cars of the same model and make. So it looks great. It looks realistic, but just be aware that it was a very labor-intensive process. And in one scene, this was not planned. In one scene, the Charger actually crashes into the camera, and then the damaged front fender of the Charger is visible in later shots. So not everything's predictable when you're doing a car chase like this, but they had a lot of world-class drivers working on this sequence, and that includes McQueen. One reason so many people thought he was cool, not just his movie personas, but also in real life. He was a race car driver, like he really was. He entered races. Sometimes he won. So he was a, professional driver himself. So in a lot of the close-up scenes, we can see him actually behind the wheel of the Mustang. But in other shots, it would be a stunt driver, and they had multiple stunt drivers working on the film, including Bill Hickman, who was kind of a famous Hollywood stunt driver. He's the guy driving the Charger. He's one of the bad guys, one of the hitmen. So you can often see him behind the wheel of the Charger, but he's not just a random actor. He was a trained stunt driver. That's why he's playing that particular role. So one way you can tell if you're looking at a shot with McQueen driving or a different stunt driver driving is paying attention to the rear view mirror, because it kind of goes up and down in different shots depending on who is driving. So when the mirror is up, McQueen is visible in the driver's seat. You can see his face, right? So that's when he's really driving. But then when the mirror is down, you can't really see who's driving. Those are the shots when it's the stunt double, when it's the stunt driver, who I believe was Bud Elkins on this one. But they had a few other drivers as well. They also had a guy doing the motorcycle stunt where he has to like slide in front of the car. That was also a professional stunt man doing that. So a lot of pros working for many weeks. They put together this sequence, and it's still kind of beloved. If you like action movies, if you like car chases, this is one of the best still to this day in American movies. So the editing was celebrated in this movie. So particularly the editing of that car chase sequence pretty much won the editor of the movie, Frank Keller, the Oscar for best editing in 1968. And it's often included in like the lists of best edited sequences of all time. Billy Fraker was the cinematographer for the film, and he often attributed a lot of the success to the car chase to the editor, Keller. He said, really, it was a mess. Like, we had so many moving parts, it really had to get assembled and made coherent by the editor in the editing room. So appropriate that Keller won the Oscar. And just as an aside, this is an argument, like a complaint that you often hear about a lot of modern action movies, is the way that like fight sequences or chase sequences are edited. It can sometimes be so rapid, like the cuts from shot to shot, it can almost be disorienting, and we don't always get a clear sense of like where people are or like people's relationship to each other physically, like in the scene. I don't know if you guys have heard that complaint, but it's one of those old person, like they used to do it better, in the old days. But truly, if you want an example of great editing, watch that car chase sequence. That really is editing as an art form. Not just practical editing, the way it was done for a long time, where, again, it's just about continuity, but editing as its own kind of form of expression, visual expression, and creating this illusion of reality, but a very accurate illusion. And then Keller, again, the editor, was often celebrated not just for that sequence, but for his ability to kind of make San Francisco. I'm sorry, not so much. Oh yeah, I'm still talking about Keller, I think. Yeah, the editor, kind of making San Francisco a character in the film. Right, because we're there, and because of the way we actually see the city, the way it's presented, the way characters seem to really inhabit the city. So some of that's the cinematography and the direction of Yates, but again, a lot of it has to do with the editing. The original score was also very popular at the time, so we had a complete score composed just for the movie. And it was done by Lalo Schifrin, and he was a jazz musician. So we have contemporary American jazz, particularly the West Coast variety. So you would have heard a lot of that kind of music in nightclubs and bars in San Francisco in the late 60s. So just another way to capture this sort of authentic effect. And just to return to McQueen here to wrap up, yeah, he's thought of as maybe one of our first really modern, like post-World War II movie stars. So along with Marlon Brando, figures like Dustin Hoffman, maybe a Gene Hackman, Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, this whole generation of actors that really get their start in some of these new Hollywood movies of the 60s and 70s. I mentioned Warren Beatty, Faye Dunaway, Jacqueline Bisset, his Bullitt's love interest. She was very famous as well. So not only was this a great place for filmmakers to innovate, this was also a fertile place for movie stars to get their start. And again, we're seeing kind of a modern form of movie stardom. McQueen's often thought of as just a super cool guy, but again, think about his performance here. Very understated, very subtle. Again, very different from the way movie stars would have played heroic cops in earlier films, right? They would have been more loud. They would have been more demonstrative. They would have been really more violent, probably. Bullitt doesn't fit all those stereotypes of like the classic cop character in this kind of a movie. He's quiet. He doesn't really talk a whole lot. He's a man of action. He certainly does a lot of heroic stuff, but it's a different way of playing it. Again, looking for more realism. He's trying to act like a real cop, not like a movie version of a cop. So that's a new way of thinking, a new way of approaching the material, and it's the way a lot of actors continue to work today. So McQueen's very influential if you want to read more about him. Died young, very tragic. Okay, that's it for this week. I will see you next week, and I'll start grading the papers soon.